Today, the topic which I'm going to discuss with you all is the next chapter of class 11, and the name of the chapter is The Address, which is written by Marga Minko. Children, this chapter, The Address, describes human predicament that follows war. War which brings only destruction in people's life. It only spoils the life of the people. In this chapter, we will talk about the Second World War, which completely changed the life of the author of the story, Marga Minko. Marga Minko is a Dutch journalist and writer. She was born in 1920, and the Second World War was fought between 1935 to 1949. Children, this Second World War not only affected the other people's life, it affected the life of the writer of the story. Her family also became one of the sufferers of that war. As you all know that during the Second World War, Jews were killed by the Germans. They were tortured very badly. They were told to leave their homes and to stay in concentration camps. And Marga Minko, who is the narrator of the story too, were also forced to leave her house. As Marga Minko also belonged to an Orthodox Jewish family. After the Second World War, Marga Minko was the only survival from her family, as she had lost all her family members in that war. So, Marga Minko's short story, The Address, is a poignant account. Children, poignant account means a painful story of a girl. Who is the girl here? The writer and the narrator of the story, Marga Minko, who goes in search of her mother's belongings to Mrs. Dorling, where the narrator's mother, Mrs. S, had kept those belongings. And Mrs. Dorling was an old acquaintance of the narrator's mother. When the narrator goes to Mrs. Dorling's house to see her dead mother's belongings, she was somewhere successful in finding, seeing, or to touch her mother's belongings. But after finding those belongings, touching them, feeling them, she decided to forget about them. She realized that she will forget about them, as those belongings could not bring her dead mother back to her life. The address, children, which her mother told her to remember, the address which belonged to Mrs. Dorling, the narrator of the story remembered that address for years. But all of a sudden, something had happened to her that she decided to forget that address also. So children, here one question arises. When the narrator, the author of the story, really wanted to see or to touch her mother's belongings, and finally she was successful in seeing them, then all of a sudden what had happened to her that she decided to forget about those belongings and to move on in her life. Let's read the chapter and find out the answers of our questions. Children, this chapter starts from the narrator's first visit to Mrs. Dorling's house, or you can say to that address where her mother's belongings were kept. Do you still know me? I asked. I here refers to Marga Minko, as I already told you that she is the writer and the narrator of the story. Do you still know me. Still means this was not the first time when the narrator was meeting Mrs. Darling. It means she had met Mrs. Darling before also. So this time the narrator was asking Mrs. Darling that did she know her? The woman looked at me searchingly. Woman here refers to Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling started looking at the narrator seriously. She had opened the door a chink. Children, a chink means a narrow opening. Mrs. Darling did not open the complete door. She opened the door a little. I came closer and stood on the step. No, I don't know you. Mrs. Darling simply refused to recognize the narrator or the author of the story. I am Mrs. S. daughter. Then the narrator of the story introduced herself to Mrs. Darling that she was the daughter of Mrs. S. She held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. So she did not want the door to open. She did not want the narrator to come in. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. As if purposely, Mrs. Darling did not want to recognize the narrator because there was no expression on the lady's face that she was able to know, she was able to recognize who the girl was. She kept staring at me in silence. The narrator said, she kept staring the girl, she kept staring the author and did not utter a word. Perhaps I was mistaken. So when the lady did not welcome the narrator in her house, when the lady refused to recognize her, the narrator thought that she had come to a wrong address. I thought perhaps it isn't her. She thought that it wasn't the address which was given to her by her mother. I had seen her only once, fleetingly, and that was years ago. So children, in this line, 3 reasons have been mentioned which made the narrator sure that she came at the wrong address. The first reason was that she met Mrs. Darling only for a short time. The second reason was she met her years before. And the third reason was she saw Mrs. Darling only once in her life. It might be possible that she had come to a wrong address. It was most probable that the narrator had rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stepped to the side. But all of a sudden, what did the lady do? She stepped to the side, the door. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. When she stepped to the side, the narrator noticed that the lady had been wearing a green cardigan which was knitted by her mother. And that green cardigan had wooden buttons on that. And the color of the buttons was pale. It means that the belongings which were given to Mrs. Darling by the narrator's mother to keep them safe, on the contrary, Mrs. Darling was using each and everything which did not belong to her. I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. So when Mrs. Darling noticed that the narrator had noticed her mother's sweater, so she started hiding herself behind the door because she did not want to return those belongings to the girl. I knew now that I was right. Initially, she thought that she had come to a wrong address, but after seeing her mother's green knitted cardigan and the way the lady was reacting, somewhere the narrator was sure that she did not come at the wrong address, she came at the right address. Where you knew my mother, I asked. So this time she asked, do you know her mother? Have you come back, said the woman. Now children, see what the lady had replied. She said she had thought that after that war, no one would survive from the family and no one would come back to claim those belongings. This shows that that lady was very greedy and cunning also. After that, she said, I thought that no one had come back. The narrator replied, only me. She replied that she had lost all her family members during the Second World War, but she is the only one who got survived, and she had come to Mrs. Darling to see her belongings, to see her dead mother's belongings. I regret I cannot do anything for you. The lady did not show any interest in talking to the narrator. I have come here especially on the train. She even requested the lady that she only wanted a small time to speak to the lady. But she said, it is not convenient for me now. I can't see you another time. The lady simply refused the narrator to talk to her. She said she is not free right now, so she wanted the girl to come the next time. She nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. So what the lady finally did? She closed the door very carefully. She did not create any kind of noise or a sound while closing the door because she did not want any other member of the family to be disturbed with the presence of that girl. Or it simply means that it was only Mrs. Darling who knew about those belongings, that those belongings did not belong to her. It might be possible that the other members of Mrs. Darling did not have an idea finally who was the real owner of those belongings. I stood where I was on the step. Someone stared at me and would then have asked me what I wanted. All of a sudden, someone who was inside the house removed the curtain from the bay window. Bay window means a large window with glass. And the person inside the house wanted to know who the girl was and what that girl wanted. But the woman would have said it was nothing, as if she did not want anyone to attend, anyone to answer the girl's questions. I looked at the nameplate again, as she knew that she came at the right address. She knew the address very well. Still, once again, she looked at the nameplate. Children, what was written on that? Darling, house number 46, Marconi Street. And finally, when the lady refused to speak to her, she left from there. And she started moving towards the railway station to catch the train to go back. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother, who had given me the address years ago. So when she was moving towards the railway station, she started recollecting the old memories of her mother. She started recollecting the day when This particular address was given to the narrator by her mother. And she said, it had been in the first half of the war. Children, while reading this chapter, you'll come to know that there are some incidents in this chapter which took place before the war, and there are some which took place after the war. In between the chapter, the narrator is recalling some incidents. So please note down that this particular incident took place before war and this particular incident took place after the war in your book. I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. I missed various things. So the narrator, when she came home for a few days, she noticed that there were few things which were missing. My mother was surprised I should have noticed so quickly. Even the narrator's mother was surprised that her daughter noticed it so quickly that there were some changes in the house and there were few things which were missing. Then she told me about Mrs. Dolly. The narrator said that was the day when she had come to know about Mrs. Dolly. She was an old acquaintance of my mother. As I already told you, acquaintance is a person whom you know. So, Mrs. S, the narrator mother, introduced Mrs. Dorling to her daughter that she was an old acquaintance to her. She knew her, whom she had not seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. Mrs. Dorling was not coming to the narrator's house quite often. Even the family did not see that lady for a long time. But all of a sudden, she started coming to the narrator's house and she wanted to renew her contact with Mrs. S. And after that day, she started coming to the narrator's house quite often. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her, said my mother. And when the narrator asked about the things which were missing in the house, the narrator's mother replied that every time when Mrs. Dorling comes to their house, she carries some belongings along with her. Now, why did Mrs. S allow Mrs. Dorling to carry their valuable things along with her? As I already told you that during the Second World War, Germans were forcing the people to leave their home. It could have happened to the narrator's family too. And the narrator's mother did not want to leave her belongings behind. She wanted to keep the belongings safe. That is why she decided that she would keep all her belongings in the custody of Mrs. Dorling. She would keep all her belongings safe, and after the Second World War, she would take those belongings back from her. She took all the table silver. Children, please underline. Now, one by one, the narrator will describe those belongings which were taken away by Mrs. Dorling to her home. Table silver. Table silver here means like spoons, forks, knives, each and everything which is a part of cutlery. Table silver, and each and everything was made of silver. So you can simply imagine that how precious, how valuable those belongings were to the narrator's family. And then the antique plates. There were some antique plates which were hung on the wall. So the first time she carried all table silver. In second visit, she picked up those antique plates and carried along. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and I'm worried she got a crack in her back from the crockery. Crack means a sudden pain in back. Though the narrator noticed that each time when Mrs. Darling was coming and carrying some belongings along with her, she was facing difficulties. She was facing problems. Even she had a pain in her back. Still, she did not bother, and she was only concentrating on carrying the all valuable things of Mrs. S to her home. My mother shook her head pityingly. When the narrator's mother noticed that she was facing difficulties, she had a pain in her back, she felt very bad for Mrs. Darling. This proves that the narrator's mother, Mrs. S, is a very simple lady. She's a kind-hearted person. I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. The narrator's mother disclosed this truth to her daughter that it was not my decision. Even it was suggested by Mrs. Darling that she could keep those belongings safe with her. She even insisted. She wanted to save all my nice things. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. The narrator said, my mother told me if they are also forced to leave their homes, at least it would be better that they won't lose their valuable things, they won't lose their belongings. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything, I asked? As if that is necessary, my mother cried. It would simply be an insult to talk to her like that. The narrator's mother said, if I doubt that lady, it means I am insulting her. And according to Mrs. S, Mrs. Darling was helping the family, keeping their belongings safe. So the narrator's mother was completely against the narrator's decision of asking Mrs. Darling that she should not carry each and every belonging along with her. And think about the risk she's done. The narrator's mother said, it is not easy for the lady to carry such belongings along with her. You just see the risk which she's facing each day. Each time she goes out of the door with a full suitcase on back. Children, please underline, each time that lady was carrying a heavy box which was full of belongings. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. Though the narrator's mother tried to explain each and everything to her daughter, tried to convince her, but somewhere it was clear that the narrator was not agreed with her mother's decision. And they had an argument over it. But after some time, both of them decided not to speak on the topic anymore. And they decided to leave it and not to speak anything on it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station. So when she was recollecting that day, when she came to know about Mrs. Darling, when she came to know that their belongings were kept with Mrs. Darling, meanwhile, she reached to the station from where she had to catch a train. She said when she had arrived at the station, without having paid much attention to things on the way, she said that while moving towards the railway station, she was least interested to see or to watch the things which were coming on her way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war, but I did not want to go further than was necessary. She knew each and every place, she knew each and every shop, she knew the people even who were moving from there. But she said she did not want to look at even a single thing. Why, children, why? What is the reason behind? The reason is, I did not want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. Yes, children, she did not want to make herself feel upset. She did not want to make herself feel uncomfortable by remembering the old things. Because we also know memories are of two kinds. Some make us happy, some make us sad. And when we recall old memories which make us feel sad, generally we avoid recalling those memories. And the same was happening with the narrator of the story too. In the train bag, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me. I saw. Children, don't be confused. Don't think that the train which she had boarded, Mrs. Darling was also a part of it. Mrs. Darling was also there in the same train. Here, saw means remembered. She is again recalling that day when she met Mrs. Darling the first time. I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me. Again, I had the first time I met her. So she is recalling that day when she had met Mrs. Darling the first time. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. I had got a plate and coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out. The narrator said a day when she got a plate, she was coming downstairs. She saw her mother seeing someone out. And children, you know who she was? Yes, absolutely right. She was Mrs. Darling. And one description about Mrs. Darling is written at the end of this paragraph, which says, a woman with a broad back. That Mrs. Darling had a broad back. There is my daughter, said my mother. So the narrator said that was the day when I met Mrs. Darling the first time. Does she live far away? I asked. So the narrator asked her mother that does Mrs. Darling live far away from their house? Because the narrator saw the lady facing the difficulties in carrying those heavy cases which she was carrying to take them to her home. The narrator further said that day the lady was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. When the narrator asked her mother, where did she live? Does she live far away? Or what is the exact address of that lady? So children, that was the time, that was the moment when that address was given to the narrator by her mother. As you all know, that the address plays an utmost importance in the narrator's life. And that is why this chapter has been given the title, The Address. That there was a time when it was very important for her, but after some time, it will lose its value. It will have no importance in her life. The narrator's mother gave the address to her daughter. She said, Marconi Street, number 46. And further she added, remember that. And the narrator said, I had remembered. As my mother wanted me to remember the address, Marconi Street, house number 46, and I had remembered. But I had waited a long time to go there. She said after the war, when the war was over, initially the narrator was not interested to go to that address or to see her mother's belongings. Initially, after the liberation means freedom, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff. Stored stuff means belongings of Mrs. S. And naturally, I was also rather afraid of it. So further, the narrator said she was even afraid of looking at those belongings. So why was the narrator afraid? Afraid of being confronted. Confronted means to face or to deal with an unpleasant situation. How come looking at the belongings becomes an unpleasant situation for the narrator? As I already told you, when we recall old memories which make us sad, we generally avoid. We do not want to recall. And the same had happened to the narrator also. The moment she looks at her mother's belongings, those belongings will remind her of her dead mother, and this will make her upset. So she was afraid of confronting. She was afraid of seeing those belongings that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed. Which connection is she talking about? Connection to her mother, connection to the belongings. As she said, because she had lost her mother, so she doesn't think that she'll have any connection or any bond with those belongings when she will look at them. And she thinks that those belongings would be hidden away in the cupboards and boxes until they are put back in their place again. Actually, she did not have an idea that Mrs. Dorling would be using all those belongings. According to her, this was given to Mrs. Dorling to keep safe. So she was thinking that all the belongings her mother would have been kept in cupboards or in boxes. They won't get that existence which they had when they were kept in her own home by her own mother. But gradually everything became normal again. Children, we all know that time is a great healer. Initially, when we get hurt, we feel so upset. We feel completely uncomfortable. But as the time passes by, we become normal. And the same had happened to the narrator too. She said that she was also becoming normal one after the other day. Bread was getting to be a lighter color as things were becoming expensive during the war. But after the war, when the war gets over, people were able to buy food. They were able to afford to buy food. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened. As when the war was going on, people were living under threat because they were in a stress that any time they can be killed by the Germans. But now the war was over, so everybody was able to take a sound sleep. And one day I noticed I was curious about all the possessions. So the things which she did not want to think, the things which she did not want to see, the things which she did not want to confront. But all of a sudden, when things became normal, the narrator became excited to look at them. And she decided that she would go to Mrs. Dorling's house and look at her mother's belongings. I wanted to see them, touch, or remember. As she really wanted to see her mother's belongings, she really wanted to see and touch. So children, I hope we all have understood the chapter till where I have explained you. So I want all of you to go through this video and note down the important points of this chapter in your notebook. Thank you.